The morning sun cast long shadows across the military training compound as Sarah Martinez walked through the gates. She wore simple civilian clothes, jeans, a plain white t-shirt, and worn sneakers. Her long black hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she carried only a small backpack. To anyone watching, she looked like just another civilian contractor arriving for work. The security guard barely glanced at her ID as she passed through the checkpoint. Behind her, a convoy of military vehicles rumbled through the entrance, carrying a group of elite soldiers who had just completed a joint training exercise. They were loud, confident, and still riding the high of their successful mission. Sarah made her way to Building C, where she had been assigned to assist with logistics planning for an upcoming operation. The assignment seemed routine enough: help organize supplies, coordinate transportation, and handle paperwork. It was the kind of task that military personnel often consider beneath them, the unglamorous work that kept operations running smoothly. As she entered the building, she could hear voices coming from the main conference room. The door was slightly open, and she could see several officers gathered around a large table covered with maps and documents. She recognized the voice of Colonel James Harrison, the base commander, speaking in his usual authoritative tone. "We need someone to handle the supply chain coordination for Operation Desert Storm," Harrison was saying. "It's not glamorous work, but it's essential. We've got a civilian contractor coming in today to take care of it." A civilian? The voice belonged to Captain Rick Stevens, a decorated officer with 15 years of service. "Sir, with respect, this operation is too important to leave in the hands of some pencil pusher who doesn't understand military operations. The Pentagon assigned her," Harrison replied. "Apparently, she has experience with this kind of work. Sarah Martinez is her name. She should be here any minute." Sarah took a deep breath and knocked on the door frame. "Excuse-moi, Colonel Harrison. I am Sarah Martinez." All eyes turned toward her, and she could immediately sense their skepticism. Captain Stevens looked her up and down with barely concealed disdain. Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Wong raised an eyebrow. Major David Thompson actually chuckled under his breath. "You're our logistics coordinator?" Stevens asked, not bothering to hide his disbelief. "You look like you just walked out of a coffee shop." Sarah maintained her composure. "Yes, sir. I'm here to help with the supply chain coordination for your upcoming operation." Harrison cleared his throat. "Well, Ms. Martinez, welcome to Fort Braxton. I hope you're prepared for the complexity of military logistics. This isn't like ordering office supplies." "I understand the importance of the work, Colonel," Sarah replied calmly. Stevens leaned back in his chair. "Do you?" "Because this operation involves coordinating supplies for 3,000 personnel across 4 different bases, managing transportation through hostile territory, and ensuring that critical equipment arrives exactly when and where it's needed. One mistake could cost lives." "I'm aware of the stakes," Sarah said. Major Thompson joined the conversation. "Have you ever worked with military operations before? Because this isn't a corporate environment where you can just email someone if something goes wrong." Sarah nodded. "I have some experience." "Some experience?" Stevens repeated mockingly. "Lady, we're talking about a multi-million-dollar operation here. We need someone who knows what they're doing, not someone with some experience." Lieutenant Colonel Wong spoke up. "What exactly is your background, Ms. Martinez?" Your file was surprisingly thin. Before Sarah could answer, Stevens interrupted. "Let me guess, business degree, maybe some time working for a defense contractor pushing papers around? And now the Pentagon thinks you can handle real military logistics." The room fell silent as Sarah considered her response. She could have told them about her 12 years in the Navy, her specialized training, her classified missions. She could have mentioned the commendations, the successful operations she had planned and executed, the lives she had helped save. Instead, she simply said, "I'll do my best to meet your expectations." This response seemed to confirm their suspicions. Stevens exchanged a look with Thompson, and both men barely suppressed smirks. "Well," Harrison said, clearly uncomfortable with the dynamic in the room, "let's get you oriented. Major Thompson, please show MS Martinez to her workspace and get her started on the preliminary supply assessments." As they left the conference room, Sarah could hear Stevens talking to Wong in a stage whisper meant to be overheard. This is exactly what's wrong with the Pentagon these days. They think they could just throw any civilian at a military problem and expect it to work out. Thompson led Sarah down a hallway lined with motivational posters and photographs of successful military operations. "Look," he said in a tone that suggested he was being generous, "I'm sure you're competent at whatever it is you normally do. But military logistics is a different beast entirely. The supply chains are complex, the timelines are unforgiving, and the consequences of failure are severe." "I understand," Sarah replied. "Do you?" Thompson stopped walking and turned to face her. "Because I've seen plenty of civilians come through here thinking they can learn everything they need to know in a few days. Military operations don't work that way. We've spent years learning these systems, understanding how they interact, knowing what can go wrong, and how to prevent it." He resumed walking and continued his monologue. "The supply assessment you'll be working on involves cataloging equipment needs for 3 different unit types, each with their own specialization and requirements. You'll need to coordinate with suppliers who have security clearances, understand transportation limitations in combat zones, and account for variables that most civilians never even consider." They arrived at a small office with a desk, computer, and several filing cabinets. The walls were bare except for a basic organizational chart and a calendar. It was clearly a space designed for temporary occupants. "This is your workspace," Thompson said. "The preliminary files are on the desk. You'll need to review equipment requirements, verify supplier capabilities, and create a preliminary logistics timeline. Think you can handle it?" "Yes, sir," Sarah replied. Thompson shook his head slightly. "We'll see. The initial assessment is due in 3 days. That might not seem like much time, but trust me, once you dig into the complexity of what we're dealing with, you'll understand why we usually assign this kind of work to experienced military personnel." After Thompson left, Sarah sat down at the desk and examined the files. The operation was indeed complex, involving multiple units, diverse equipment needs, and challenging transportation requirements. But as she began to review the documents, she found herself automatically organizing the information in ways that drew on years of experience that none of her colleagues suspected she possessed. The door opened, and Stevens walked in without knocking. "Settling in?" he asked with false friendliness. "Yes, thank you," Sarah replied. "Good, good." Stevens looked around the sparse office. "You know, I've been thinking about our conversation earlier. I may have come across as a bit harsh. It's nothing personal, you understand. It's just that we've seen this before, civilians who think military work is just like any other job." He sat down across from her desk, uninvited. "The thing is, Ms. Martinez, this operation we're planning, it's not a training exercise. Real soldiers are going to depend on the logistics plan you're putting together. If equipment doesn't arrive on time, if supplies are insufficient, if transportation gets delayed, people die. That's the reality we live with." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "I take that responsibility seriously, Captain." "I'm sure you think you do," Stevens continued. "But there's a difference between understanding something intellectually and really comprehending what it means. When I was in Afghanistan, we had a supply convoy that arrived 6 hours late because someone back in logistics made what they thought was a minor scheduling adjustment. 6 hours. You know what happened during those 6 hours?" He paused, clearly expecting her to ask, but Sarah remained silent. 3 of my men were wounded because we didn't have the medical supplies we were supposed to have," Stevens continued. "All because someone who had never been in combat thought they could improve the schedule." "That must have been very difficult," Sarah said quietly. Stevens studied her face, perhaps looking for signs that his story was having the intended impact. "The point is, this work requires more than just good intentions and basic competence. It requires understanding how every decision ripples through the entire operation. It requires experience with the real-world consequences of military logistics." "I understand your concerns, Captain," Sarah replied. "I'll make sure to be thorough in my work." Stevens stood up, apparently satisfied that he had made his point. "I hope so, because if this logistics plan fails, it won't be your career on the line. It'll be the lives of the soldiers who depend on it." After he left, Sarah returned to the files. As she worked, she could hear conversations in the hallway. Her name came up frequently, usually accompanied by skeptical comments about civilian contractors and concerns about the wisdom of assigning such important work to someone without military experience. By the end of the first day, Sarah had completed a preliminary review that would typically take most people several days. Her analysis was thorough, detailed, and identified several potential problems that previous assessments had missed. She had also begun developing solutions to address the logistical challenges she had identified. As she prepared to leave for the day, Colonel Harrison stopped by her office. "How are you settling in, Ms. Martinez?" "Very well, thank you, Colonel," she replied. "Good. I want you to know that while some of my officers may seem skeptical, it's only because they care deeply about the success of our operations. Nothing personal." "I understand completely, sir." Harrison glanced at the work spread across her desk. "You seem to be making good progress already. That's encouraging. Thank you. The operation is well planned overall. I'm just working through some of the logistical details." "Well, take your time. We want to make sure everything is done right." Harrison paused at the doorway. "Oh, and Ms. Martinez, don't let the skepticism get to you. Prove them wrong with your work, not your words." As Sarah gathered her things and prepared to leave, she reflected on the day's interactions. The skepticism and condescension she had encountered were not entirely unexpected. She had faced similar attitudes before in different contexts and had learned that the most effective response was simply to let her work speak for itself. Walking to her car, she passed groups of soldiers finishing their training for the day. They moved with the confidence and camaraderie that came from shared experience and mutual trust. She understood that dynamic, perhaps better than anyone suspected. Her small apartment off base was sparsely furnished, but comfortable. As she prepared a simple dinner, she thought about the logistics challenges she would tackle the next day. The operation they were planning was indeed complex, but she had handled far more challenging situations under much more difficult circumstances. She absently twisted a ring on her right hand as she reviewed her notes from the day. It was a simple gold band with an intricate design that most people would not recognize. Those who would recognize it understood its significance immediately. It identified her as a member of one of the most elite military units in the world. But, for now, that information remained her secret. She had learned long ago that respect earned through demonstrated competence was more valuable than respect commanded through reputation or credentials. Tomorrow, she would continue to let her work prove her worth, regardless of what her colleagues assumed about her background. The challenges ahead were significant, but Sarah Martinez had faced far greater challenges before. The difference was that this time, she was fighting with spreadsheets and supply chains instead of weapons and tactics. The stakes were just as high, but the battlefield was a conference room instead of a combat zone. As she settled in for the night, she could already envision solutions to several of the logistical problems she had identified. The operation would succeed, not because she demanded respect, but because she had earned the right to ensure its success through years of training and experience that none of her colleagues suspected she possessed. The morning would bring new challenges and new opportunities to prove herself. For now, Sarah was content to let her work speak for itself, knowing that eventually, the truth about her capabilities would become impossible to ignore. The second day began with Sarah arriving at the base before most of the military personnel. She had always been an early riser, a habit formed during years of military service where preparation and punctuality were not just preferences but requirements that could mean the difference between success and failure. As she settled into her workspace, she noticed that someone had left additional files on her desk. A note attached indicated they were supplementary requirements that had been forgotten in yesterday's briefing. Sarah suspected this was less oversight and more testing, an attempt to see how she would handle last-minute additions to an already complex assignment. She began integrating the new requirements into her analysis, quickly identifying how they would impact timelines, transportation needs, and supply chain coordination. Rather than simply adding them to her existing plan, she restructured her entire approach to accommodate the additional complexity while actually improving overall efficiency. Captain Stevens arrived at his office around 7:30 and was surprised to see lights already on in the contractor's workspace. He walked over to investigate and found Sarah deep in concentration, surrounded by charts, graphs, and detailed logistics breakdowns. "You're here early," he observed, though his tone suggested this was somehow suspicious rather than commendable. "Yes, sir. I wanted to integrate the additional requirements that were provided yesterday evening." Stevens looked at the work spread across her desk with surprise. The level of detail and organization was far beyond what he had expected from a civilian contractor. The charts were color-coded and cross-referenced, the timelines were precise and accounted for variables he had not even considered, and the supply calculations appeared to be not only accurate, but optimized for efficiency. "This is quite thorough," he admitted reluctantly. "Thank you. I noticed there were some opportunities to improve the overall logistics flow by adjusting the sequencing of certain deliveries and consolidating transportation where possible." Stevens picked up one of the charts and studied it more closely. Despite his skepticism about Sarah's qualifications, he could not find any obvious flaws in her work. In fact, her analysis had identified several potential bottlenecks that his own logistics team had missed. "Where did you learn to do this kind of analysis?" he asked, his tone now more curious than confrontational. "Experience," Sarah replied simply. Before Stevens could probe further, Major Thompson arrived with coffee and a stack of morning reports. He stopped short when he saw the extent of Sarah's work. "Jesus," he muttered under his breath. "This looks like the kind of analysis our logistics team would take weeks to produce." "It's quite impressive," Stevens agreed, though he seemed uncomfortable admitting it. Thompson studied one of the transportation schedules Sarah had created. "Wait a minute. How did you know about the bridge weight restrictions on Route 7? That information isn't in the standard briefing materials." Sarah paused, realizing she had revealed knowledge that a typical civilian contractor would not possess. "I did some additional research on the transportation infrastructure in the area." "Additional research?" Stevens raised an eyebrow. "The detailed specifications for military transportation routes are classified. Where exactly did you find this information?" This was dangerous territory. Sarah's access to classified transportation data came from her military background and security clearance, information she was not ready to reveal. "I have contacts who were able to provide general guidance on infrastructure limitations." Thompson and Stevens exchanged glances. They were clearly suspicious, but could not quite put their finger on what was bothering them about her responses. "Well," Thompson said slowly, "regardless of how you obtained the information, this level of analysis is beyond what we expected. You might actually know what you're doing after all." The backhanded compliment was typical of the attitude Sarah had encountered since arriving at the base. Every demonstration of competence was treated as an unexpected surprise rather than confirmation of her qualifications. Lieutenant Colonel Wong arrived for the morning briefing and was immediately drawn to Sarah's workspace by the conversation. She examined the logistics plans with the eye of someone who had spent years managing complex military operations. "This is exceptional work," Wong said after several minutes of review. "The integration of transportation scheduling with supply delivery timing is particularly sophisticated. Most logistics coordinators never achieve this level of optimization." "Thank you, ma'am," Sarah replied. "Where did you develop these skills?" Wong asked directly. This kind of analysis requires understanding military operations at a level that most civilians never achieve. Again, Sarah found herself walking a careful line between honesty and maintaining her cover. "I've worked on complex supply chain problems in various contexts." Wong continued studying the charts. "The way you've accounted for security protocols and the transportation scheduling suggests familiarity with military security procedures. That's not something you typically learn in civilian logistics work." Stevens was now paying close attention to this line of questioning. "You know, Ms. Martinez, your resume was remarkably vague about your previous experience. Perhaps you could be more specific about your background?" Sarah felt the weight of their scrutiny, but maintained her calm exterior. "I prefer to let my work speak for itself, rather than rely on credentials." "That's admirable," Wong said, "but we're curious about where you learned to think like a military logistics officer. Because that's essentially what this analysis represents, military-grade logistics planning." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Harrison, who had come to check on the morning's progress. He took one look at Sarah's workspace and stopped short. "What's all this?" he asked. "Ms. Martinez has been working on the preliminary logistics assessment," Stevens explained. "The results are quite surprising." Harrison examined the work more closely. As a career military officer with experience in large-scale operations, he immediately recognized the sophistication of what he was seeing. "This is outstanding," he said after several minutes. "The level of detail and strategic thinking here rivals the work of our most experienced logistics officers." He looked up at Sarah with new respect. "Where did you learn to do this?" Before Sarah could answer, Stevens interjected. "That's what we've been trying to figure out, sir." Ms. Martinez has been somewhat evasive about her background. "Not evasive," Sarah corrected calmly. "Simply focused on the work at hand, rather than past credentials." Harrison nodded thoughtfully. "Well, regardless of your background, this is exceptional work. You've identified optimization opportunities that our own team missed, and your timeline projections are remarkably sophisticated." "Thank you, Colonel. I'm curious, though," Harrison continued. "How did you account for the variable readiness requirements across different unit types? That kind of nuanced understanding typically comes from direct experience with military operations." Sarah chose her words carefully. "I try to think through how different units might have different preparation needs and timing requirements." Thompson shook his head. "It's more than that. Look at how she's accounted for the psychological factors in unit deployment scheduling. She's actually optimized the timeline to account for morale and readiness factors that most logistics planners never even consider." The group fell silent as they continued to examine her work. Sarah could sense their growing puzzlement. Her analysis was clearly beyond what they had expected from a civilian contractor, but they could not quite figure out how to reconcile this competence with their assumptions about her background. The tension was broken by the arrival of Sergeant Major Rodriguez, the base's senior enlisted advisor. Rodriguez had 30 years of military experience and was known for his ability to spot inconsistencies and assess people's true capabilities. "Colonel, you wanted me to review the logistics assessment?" Rodriguez asked. "Yes, Sergeant Major. Ms. Martinez has completed the preliminary analysis. I like your thoughts." Rodriguez began examining the charts and schedules with the methodical attention of someone who had seen countless logistics plans succeed and fail. His review was more thorough than the others, and Sarah could see him noting specific details and cross-referencing different elements of the plan. After 20 minutes of careful study, Rodriguez looked up at Sarah with an expression she could not quite read. "This is very good work," he said quietly. "Very good indeed." He paused, then continued. "The way you've structured the equipment staging areas shows understanding of tactical considerations that most logistics planners never learn. The timing sequences account for variables that only someone with field experience would know to consider." The room was now completely focused on this exchange. Rodriguez's reputation for identifying talent and assessing capabilities was legendary, and his opinion carried significant weight. "Tell me, Ms. Martinez," Rodriguez continued, "how did you know to account for the maintenance cycle requirements in your equipment rotation schedule?" This was another piece of specialized knowledge that Sarah had included automatically based on her military experience. Equipment maintenance cycles were critical to operational readiness, but were often overlooked in civilian logistics planning. It seemed logical that equipment would need regular maintenance to remain operational, she replied. Rodriguez smiled slightly. "Logical, perhaps, but the specific timing intervals you've used are precisely the standard military maintenance protocols. That's not something you would guess at or figure out through logic alone." The silence in the room was now pregnant with suspicion. Everyone was beginning to realize that Sarah's knowledge went far beyond what a typical civilian contractor should possess. Stevens finally voiced what everyone was thinking. Ms. Martinez, I think it's time you told us exactly what your background is. Because what we're seeing here suggests military training and experience that you haven't acknowledged. Sarah looked around the room at the faces of the officers and senior enlisted personnel who were now studying her with intense curiosity. She had reached a crossroads where maintaining her cover was becoming more difficult than revealing the truth. My experience is varied, she said carefully. That's not an answer, Wong pressed. Your work demonstrates knowledge that typically takes years of military service to develop. Either you're the most naturally gifted civilian logistics coordinator we've ever encountered, or you have military background that you haven't disclosed. Rodriguez stepped closer. You know what I think? I think you're former military. The way you organize information, the factors you consider, the assumptions you make, they all point to someone with significant military experience. The question is why you're not acknowledging it. Harrison held up a hand to pause the interrogation. Ms. Martinez, let me ask this directly. Do you have military experience that would be relevant to this assignment? Sarah knew that her answer would change everything. Once she acknowledged her military background, they would want details. And once they had details, her carefully maintained cover would be blown completely. I have some military experience, she admitted finally. The admission hung in the air like a confession. Everyone in the room leaned forward slightly, waiting for more details. Some military experience? Stevens repeated. What kind of experience? Naval service, Sarah replied simply. How long? Harrison asked. 12 years. The number surprised everyone. 12 years was not a brief stint or casual military service. It represented a career of significant commitment and substantial experience. What was your rate? Rodriguez asked, using the Navy term for military specialty. Sarah hesitated. Her actual rate would reveal far more than she was prepared to discuss. Logistics specialist, she said, which was technically true but dramatically understated her actual qualifications. Wong was now looking at her with completely new eyes. 12 years as a Navy logistics specialist would explain your competence. But it raises the question of why you didn't mention this background when you arrived. The assignment was based on my current civilian credentials, Sarah replied. I didn't think my military background was directly relevant. Stevens laughed, but there was no humor in it. Not directly relevant? Your military background is the only thing that explains your capabilities. Without that context, we've been treating you like an amateur when you're clearly a professional. Harrison was studying her with new interest. What was your rank when you separated from the Navy? Another dangerous question. Sarah's actual rank would reveal the level of responsibility and expertise she had achieved, information that would lead to more questions about her specific assignments and qualifications. E6, she said, which was true as far as it went, though it was not her final rank. Rodriguez nodded. Petty officer, first class. That's significant experience and responsibility. You should have mentioned this from the beginning. Perhaps, Sarah agreed. But I wanted to be judged on my current work rather than past service. The conversation was interrupted by an aide who appeared at the door. Colonel Harrison? General Morrison's office called. He wants to see the preliminary logistics assessment as soon as it's ready. Harrison looked at Sarah's completed analysis. Well, it appears to be ready now. Ms. Martinez, would you be willing to present your findings to General Morrison? This was exactly what Sarah had been hoping to avoid. General Morrison would likely ask more detailed questions about her background and methodology. Her military experience would become even more difficult to downplay. But she had committed to this assignment, and backing down now would only raise more questions. Of course, Colonel. When would the general like to meet? This afternoon, 2 o'clock. Harrison gathered up her charts and schedules. I have to say, Ms. Martinez, this revelation about your military background puts your work in a completely different light. This isn't just competent civilian logistics. This is professional military-grade analysis. As the group dispersed, Sarah remained at her desk, aware that the dynamic had shifted fundamentally. Her secret was partially out, but the full extent of her capabilities and experience remained hidden. The afternoon meeting with General Morrison would be the real test of whether she could maintain the careful balance between demonstrating competence and revealing too much about her true background. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows of General Morrison's office as Sarah prepared her presentation materials. She had spent the lunch hour refining her logistics analysis and preparing for questions that would inevitably probe deeper in her background and methodology. General Morrison was known throughout the military as a demanding but fair leader who valued competence above all else. His office walls were lined with commendations from 3 decades of distinguished service, including deployments to some of the most challenging theaters of operation around the world. At precisely 2 o'clock, Sarah arrived at the general's outer office, where his aide, Captain Jennifer Walsh, reviewed her materials one final time. The general appreciates thorough preparation, Walsh advised. He'll want to understand not just what you're recommending, but why you're recommending it and how confident you are in your analysis. Understood, Sarah replied. One more thing, Walsh added. General Morrison has a reputation for asking unexpected questions. He likes to test people's depth of knowledge and ability to think on their feet. At 2:15, Walsh escorted Sarah into the general's office. Morrison was reviewing a different set of documents when they entered, and he gestured for Sarah to take a seat at the conference table while he finished his review. General Morrison was an imposing figure, even seated behind his desk. His gray hair was perfectly trimmed, his uniform was immaculate, and his bearing conveyed the confidence of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of lives. Ms. Martinez, he said, looking up from his documents. I've heard impressive things about your logistics analysis. Colonel Harrison seems quite pleased with your work. Thank you, General. I've tried to be thorough in my assessment. Morrison moved to the conference table and sat across from Sarah. I understand you have a Navy background. What was your rate? Logistics specialist, sir. How long did you serve? 12 years, General. Morrison nodded. Significant experience. What brought you into civilian contracting work? The question was casual, but Sarah sensed it was more than small talk. I wanted to apply my skills in a different context, sir. I see. Morrison opened the folder containing her analysis. Well, let's see what those skills have produced. Walk me through your assessment. Sarah began presenting her findings, using the charts and schedule she had prepared. She explained how she had identified inefficiencies in the proposed supply chains, optimized transportation routes, and developed contingency plans for various scenarios. Morrison listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions that demonstrated his own deep understanding of logistics operations. As the presentation continued, Sarah could see that he was impressed by the thoroughness and sophistication of her work. This optimization of the equipment staging areas is particularly well done, Morrison commented. You've managed to reduce transportation time while improving security protocols. How did you identify this approach? I analyzed the geographical constraints and security requirements, then looked for solutions that addressed both simultaneously, Sarah replied. The timing sequences for different unit deployments show remarkable understanding of military readiness factors, Morrison continued. Most logistics planners focus solely on moving equipment efficiently, without considering the psychological and operational factors that affect unit performance. I try to think holistically about what would contribute to mission success, Sarah said. Morrison studied one of her charts more closely. This contingency planning for alternative transportation routes assumes familiarity with classified infrastructure information. How did you obtain this level of detail? Sarah felt the familiar tension of walking the line between competence and revelation. I consulted available resources and drew on previous experience with similar challenges. Previous experience? Morrison looked up from the chart. What kind of previous experience would give you familiarity with military transportation security protocols? Before Sarah could answer, there was a knock on the door. Captain Walsh entered with an urgent message for the general. Sir, we just received intelligence about potential security threats along Route 12, which is one of the primary transportation corridors for the operation. The threat assessment team needs immediate guidance. Morrison frowned and turned to Sarah. Route 12 is central to your logistics plan. How quickly can you develop alternative approaches? Sarah looked at the map on the wall, quickly assessing the geographical constraints and alternative options. There are 3 viable alternatives, each with different trade-offs in terms of timing, security, and resource requirements. Explain, Morrison said. Route 15 adds approximately 4 hours to transportation time, but offers better natural cover and reduced exposure to the identified threat areas. Route 8 maintains similar timing, but requires additional security escorts. Route 23 is the fastest alternative, but passes through areas with limited communication coverage. Morrison was impressed by the speed and clarity of her analysis. Recommendations? Route 15 for the initial equipment convoy, since timing is less critical for setup operations. Route 8 for personnel transportation, since their security is paramount. Route 23 for emergency resupply only, and only if communication protocols can be enhanced. The general turned to Captain Walsh. Get the threat assessment team in here immediately, and contact Colonel Harrison. We need to implement these route changes as soon as possible. As Walsh left to arrange the meeting, Morrison turned back to Sarah with new interest. That was impressive situational analysis. You adapted your logistics plan to changing security conditions faster than most of my staff officers could manage. Thank you, sir. No, seriously, Morrison continued. The speed and quality of that assessment suggests training and experience that goes well beyond standard logistics work. What exactly was your specialty in Navy? This was the question Sarah had been dreading. Her actual Navy specialty would immediately reveal capabilities far beyond what she had been claiming. I worked in various capacities supporting naval operations, she said carefully. Morrison's eyes narrowed slightly. He had spent enough time evaluating personnel to recognize evasion when he heard it. Ms. Martinez, let me be direct. Your work demonstrates capabilities that suggest advanced military training. Your ability to rapidly assess security implications, optimize complex logistics under changing conditions, and integrate tactical considerations into operational planning. These are not skills that develop through routine logistics work. The door opened again, and the threat assessment team filed into the office. Major Patricia Chun, the intelligence officer, spread new maps and threat assessments on the conference table. General, we've confirmed hostile activity along Route 12, Chun reported. Recommend immediate suspension of all transportation along that corridor. Morrison gestured towards Sarah. Ms. Martinez has already developed alternative routing options. Show them your analysis. Sarah found herself in the unusual position of briefing a military intelligence team on operational alternatives. As she explained her routing recommendations, she could see the intelligence officers taking careful notes and nodding appreciatively at her reasoning. The assessment of communication vulnerabilities along Route 23 is particularly astute, Major Chin commented. That's exactly the kind of operational security consideration that often gets overlooked in logistics planning. Lieutenant Colonel Davies from the operations staff studied Sarah's alternative routes. How did you factor in the maintenance requirements for vehicles using these different routes? The terrain variations will affect mechanical stress and fuel consumption. I accounted for increased maintenance intervals and fuel requirements based on the terrain analysis, Sarah replied, pointing to specific calculations in her documentation. Davies looked surprised. These calculations are remarkably precise. The maintenance factors you're using are consistent with military vehicle performance standards that aren't typically available to civilian contractors. The room fell silent as everyone processed this observation. Sarah realized she had once again revealed knowledge that raised questions about her background. General Morrison was now studying her with intense curiosity. Ms. Martinez, I think it's time for complete transparency. Your analysis demonstrates familiarity with classified performance specifications, tactical security considerations, and operational planning methodologies that require specialized training and security clearance. Sarah looked around the room at the faces of the intelligence and operations officers who were now focused on her with obvious suspicion and curiosity. General, my background includes experience that may be more extensive than I initially indicated. How extensive? Morrison asked directly. Before Sarah could answer, Major Chin spoke up. Sir, perhaps we should continue this conversation without the full group present. Morrison nodded. Good point. Everyone except Ms. Martinez, please step outside. We'll reconvene in 15 minutes. As the other officers filed out, Sarah found herself alone with General Morrison. The dynamic in the room had shifted completely, and she could sense that her carefully maintained cover was about to be blown entirely. Morrison sat back in his chair and studied her intently. All right, Ms. Martinez. No audience, no politics, no games. Who are you really? Sarah took a deep breath. She had reached the point where continued deception would be more problematic than disclosure. General, my actual naval service was in special operations. Morrison's eyebrows rose. What kind of special operations? Naval special warfare. The admission hung in the air between them. Morrison leaned forward, his entire demeanor shifting as he processed this information. Naval special warfare, he repeated slowly. Are you telling me you're a Navy SEAL? Sarah nodded. Yes, sir. Morrison sat back, looking at her with completely new eyes. Jesus Christ. How long were you with the teams? 8 years of the 12 I served. What was your actual rank? I retired as a senior chief petty officer. Morrison shook his head in amazement. Senior chief. That's E8. You told my staff you were an E6. That was my rank when I first became a SEAL. I thought it was less complicated. Complicated? Morrison almost laughed. Ms. Martinez, or should I say Senior Chief Martinez, you've been letting my officers treat you like an amateur when you're one of the most highly trained military professionals in the world. I prefer to let my work speak for itself, sir. Morrison stood up and walked to the window, processing this revelation. This explains everything. The tactical thinking, the security awareness, the ability to adapt under pressure. You haven't been doing logistics planning. You've been doing mission planning. The skill sets overlap considerably, Sarah agreed. They do indeed. Morrison turned back to face her. The question now is why someone with your background and qualifications is working as a civilian contractor instead of continuing in military service. It was another difficult question, one that touched on personal decisions and experiences that Sarah was not eager to discuss. Sometimes people need a change of pace, General. Morrison nodded, understanding that there were likely personal reasons behind her transition to civilian life that were none of his business. Well, Senior Chief, this certainly changes the dynamic of our operation. With your actual background, you're not just qualified to handle our logistics, you're overqualified. The question is whether you're willing to take on a more substantial role. What did you have in mind, sir? I want you to transition from logistics support to operational planning. Your SEAL background means you understand the tactical implications of logistics decisions in ways that most planners never will. You can help us optimize this operation not just for efficiency, but for mission success. Sarah considered the offer. Taking on a more prominent role would mean revealing her background to the entire team, dealing with their reactions to having been wrong about her capabilities, and stepping back into the kind of military planning role she had left behind. But it would also mean ensuring that the operation had the best possible chance of success, which had always been her primary motivation. I'd be honored to help in whatever capacity you think would be most valuable, General. Morrison smiled for the first time since the meeting began. Outstanding. Now let's bring the team back in and explain to them that their logistics contractor is actually one of the most qualified special operations veterans in the Navy. As Captain Walsh was called to bring the other officers back into the room, Sarah realized that her carefully maintained cover was about to be blown entirely. The next few minutes would fundamentally change how everyone on the base viewed her capabilities and background. Morrison looked at her as they waited for the team to return. You know, Senior Chief, I have to ask, what's that ring you're wearing? I noticed you twist it when you're thinking. Sarah looked down at the simple gold band on her right hand. The moment of truth had arrived completely. It's a Navy SEAL ring, sir. Morrison's eyes widened as he recognized the significance. I thought it might be. I've only seen a few of those in my career. The door opened, and the intelligence and operations team filed back into the room, ready to continue their planning session. They had no idea that everything they thought they knew about their logistics contractor was about to change. As the intelligence and operations team settled back into their seats around the conference table, General Morrison stood at the head of the room with an expression that suggested significant revelations were about to unfold. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison began, "before we continue with operational planning, there's something important you need to know about Ms. Martinez." The officers looked between Morrison and Sarah with curiosity. Major Chun had her notebook ready, assuming they were about to discuss some aspect of Sarah's logistics analysis that required clarification. "It turns out that our logistics contractor has been somewhat modest about her background," Morrison continued. "Ms. Martinez, would you please share your actual military experience with the team?" Sarah stood up, knowing that the next few moments would completely transform how these officers viewed her. "My name is Sarah Martinez, and I served 12 years in the United States Navy. 8 of those years were with Naval Special Warfare Command as a Navy SEAL. My final rank was Senior Chief Petty Officer." The silence in the room was profound. Major Chin's pen stopped moving across her notebook. Lieutenant Colonel Davies's mouth opened slightly. Captain Walsh, who had been taking notes on her tablet, looked up with an expression of complete shock. Major Chun was the first to speak. "You're a Navy SEAL?" "Yes, ma'am." Lieutenant Colonel Davies leaned back in his chair. "Senior Chief Petty Officer. That's significant experience and responsibility." 8 years with the teams, Major Chin repeated, as if saying it aloud would help her process the information. "What was your specialty?" "I worked in various capacities, but my primary focus was operational planning and mission support." Captain Walsh finally found her voice. "Ma'am, with respect, why didn't you mention this when you arrived? This completely changes everything." Sarah chose her words carefully. "I was assigned to handle logistics coordination. I didn't think my military background was necessarily relevant to the civilian contracting role." Morrison interjected. "What Senior Chief Martinez is too modest to mention is that her logistics coordination has actually been military-grade operational planning from the beginning. Everything we've been impressed by suddenly makes perfect sense." Davies was now studying Sarah's documentation with new understanding. "The tactical considerations in your routing analysis, the security protocols, the contingency planning, this isn't civilian logistics thinking. This is special operations mission planning. It's the same skill set applied to a different context," Sarah agreed. Major Chin shook her head slowly. "I can't believe the way we've been talking to you." She trailed off, clearly embarrassed. "There's no need for concern," Sarah replied. "You had no reason to assume otherwise." Morrison moved to the map on the wall. "Now that we understand Senior Chief Martinez's actual capabilities, I want to expand her role in this operation. Instead of just handling logistic support, I want her involved in full operational planning." This announcement created another wave of surprise among the team members. Being included in operational planning meant access to classified information, decision-making authority, and responsibility for mission-critical elements. "Sir," Davies said, "operational planning requires security clearance verification and—" "Already checked," Morrison interrupted. "Senior Chief Martinez maintains active security clearances from her military service. She's fully qualified for operational planning involvement." Captain Walsh was still processing the revelation. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, what operations were you involved in during your SEAL service?" Sarah had expected this question, but was not prepared to discuss the classified details of her military assignments. "I can't provide specifics about particular operations, but my experience included both combat and support missions in various theaters." "Combat missions?" Chin asked. "Yes, ma'am." The weight of this simple acknowledgement settled over the room. Everyone present understood that Sarah had served in some of the most dangerous and challenging military operations in the world. The woman they had been treating as a civilian contractor was actually a combat veteran with experience in special operations. Davies was now looking at her logistics analysis with complete reverence. Your contingency planning for the Route 12 alternatives. You weren't just thinking about transportation efficiency. You were thinking about tactical implications. Correct. In special operations, logistics and tactics are inseparable. Every supply decision affects mission capability, and every tactical decision affects logistical requirements. Morrison returned to his seat. This is exactly why I want Senior Chief Martinez involved in operational planning. Her perspective will help us optimize this mission in ways that traditional planning approaches might miss. Major Chun had been quiet for several minutes, apparently processing the implications of Sarah's revelation. Finally, she spoke up. Senior Chief, your threat assessment capabilities. When you analyzed the Route 12 alternatives, you were drawing on actual field experience with hostile environments. Yes, ma'am. Understanding threat patterns and tactical implications is essential for mission success. This changes our entire approach, Davies said. Instead of treating logistics as support for operations, we can integrate them from the beginning. Morrison nodded approvingly. Exactly. Senior Chief Martinez, I want you to review our entire operational plan and provide recommendations for optimization. Not just logistics support, but tactical integration. Sarah felt the weight of returning to the kind of responsibility she had carried during her military service. Yes, sir. I'll need access to the complete mission parameters and intelligence assessments. Captain Walsh will arrange full access, Morrison replied. Treat Senior Chief Martinez as a senior operational planner with full authority to recommend modifications. As the meeting transitioned into detailed operational discussion, Sarah found herself back in her element. The other officers, now understanding her background, began consulting her on tactical questions and seeking her input on mission planning decisions. Senior Chief, Chun said, given your field experience, what's your assessment of the proposed insertion timeline? Sarah studied the mission schedule. The current timeline doesn't account for acclimatization requirements or pre-mission preparation factors that could affect performance. I'd recommend adjusting the schedule to include additional preparation time. How much additional time? Davies asked. At least 48 hours for acclimatization and equipment familiarization, plus contingency time for weather or other environmental factors. Morrison was taking notes as she spoke. What else concerns you about the current plan? The equipment loadout assumes optimal conditions throughout the mission. In my experience, it's better to plan for equipment degradation and include redundancy for critical systems. Specific recommendations? Walsh asked. Sarah began outlining modifications that would improve mission resilience and increase the probability of success. Her recommendations drew on years of experience with what actually worked in real-world operations, as opposed to what looked good in theoretical planning. As the discussion continued, the other officers found themselves deferring to Sarah's expertise on matters they had never considered from a practical perspective. Her insights were changing fundamental assumptions about how the operation should be structured. Senior Chief, Morrison said after 2 hours of detailed planning discussion, your input has been invaluable. This mission is going to be significantly more robust because of your involvement. Thank you, sir. I'm glad to contribute. Davies closed his planning folder. I have to ask, how do you feel about the way we treated you when you first arrived? We were pretty condescending to someone with your background. Sarah smiled slightly. I understood your perspective. You had no reason to assume otherwise, and I chose not to correct those assumptions immediately. Still, Chin said, we should have recognized competence when we saw it, regardless of assumptions about background. The important thing is that we're working effectively together now, Sarah replied. Morrison stood up, signaling the end of the planning session. Senior Chief Martinez, I want you to prepare a comprehensive operational assessment for tomorrow morning. Include your recommendations for tactical integration, logistics optimization, and contingency planning. Yes, sir. And, Senior Chief? Morrison paused at the door. Thank you for your patience with our initial misconceptions. Your professionalism in handling that situation speaks well of your character. As the other officers filed out, Sarah remained behind to gather her materials. She reflected on how dramatically the situation had changed over the course of a few hours. The respect she now received was gratifying, but she had mixed feelings about revealing her background. Captain Walsh approached as Sarah was organizing her documents. "Senior Chief, I wanted to apologize personally for the way I initially treated you. It was unprofessional. No apology necessary, Captain. You were protecting the mission by ensuring that personnel were properly qualified. I should have recognized that your work demonstrated qualifications regardless of background assumptions." Sarah nodded. "The important thing is that we're focused on mission success now." Walsh hesitated, then continued. "If you don't mind me asking, what made you decide to leave the teams for civilian work?" It was a question Sarah had been asked several times since revealing her background, and one that touched on personal decisions she was not eager to discuss publicly. "Sometimes people reach a point where they need a different kind of challenge," she replied diplomatically. Walsh seemed to understand that this was not a topic Sarah wanted to explore further. "Well, the mission is lucky to have your expertise, whatever brought you here." As Sarah prepared to leave for the day, she thought about the conversation she would need to have with Colonel Harrison and the other base personnel who had initially been skeptical of her capabilities. Word would spread quickly about her actual background, and she would need to manage the transition from being viewed as an inexperienced contractor to being recognized as a highly qualified special operations veteran. The next day would bring new challenges as she worked to integrate her tactical expertise with the operational planning team. But for the first time since arriving at the base, Sarah felt that she was able to contribute at the level of her actual capabilities rather than having to constrain herself to match others' limited expectations. Walking to her car, she noticed several groups of personnel who seemed to be discussing something with unusual intensity. Word about her background was clearly spreading through the base's informal communication networks. By tomorrow, everyone would know that the quiet civilian contractor they had dismissed was actually one of the most highly trained military professionals among them. Sarah absently twisted her Navy SEAL ring as she drove home, reflecting on how quickly perceptions could change when the truth finally emerged. Tomorrow would be interesting indeed. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the base to find the atmosphere had changed completely. Word of her Navy SEAL background had spread throughout the facility overnight, and she could feel the shift in how personnel looked at her as she walked through the corridors. Conversations stopped when she passed. Officers nodded respectfully. Enlisted personnel stepped aside with obvious deference. The casual dismissal she had experienced during her first days had been replaced by something approaching awe. Captain Stevens was waiting for her when she reached her office, which had been relocated overnight to the Operational Planning Center. He stood when she entered, something he had not done during any of their previous interactions. "Senior Chief Martinez," he began formally, "I owe you an apology." "That's not necessary, Captain," Sarah replied, though she could see the sincerity in his expression. "It is necessary," Stevens insisted. "The way I treated you when you first arrived was unprofessional and disrespectful. I made assumptions based on incomplete information and allowed those assumptions to affect my behavior." Sarah set down her materials and faced Stevens directly. "Captain, you were protecting what you thought were the best interests of the mission. That's commendable, even if your initial assessment was incorrect." "No, it's more than that," Stevens continued. "Even if you had been a civilian contractor, the condescending attitude I displayed was inappropriate. Competence should be recognized and respected regardless of background." Major Thompson appeared in the doorway, apparently having heard part of the conversation. "Senior Chief, I wanted to add my apologies as well. We should have recognized the quality of your work regardless of our assumptions about your experience." Lieutenant Colonel Wong joined them, creating an impromptu gathering of the officers who had initially been most skeptical of Sarah's qualifications. "Senior Chief," Wong said, "we've all been discussing this, and we wanted you to know that we've learned something important from this experience. We let preconceptions cloud our professional judgment." Sarah looked at the three officers who had been her harshest critics just days earlier. Their genuine contrition was obvious, but she also wanted to use this moment to address broader issues. I appreciate your words, she began, but I think there's a larger lesson here. The assumptions you made weren't just about me personally. They were about what qualifications look like and where expertise can be found. Stevens nodded. You're right. We assumed that because you didn't fit our expectations visually and didn't announce credentials immediately, you must lack competence. That kind of thinking can cause organizations to overlook valuable contributions from people who don't fit traditional profiles, Sarah continued. In special operations, we learn to judge people by their performance, not their appearance or background. Thompson spoke up. How do we do better in the future? Focus on work quality first, Sarah replied. Ask questions about capabilities rather than making assumptions. And remember that the most qualified person in the room might not be the one who looks most familiar. The conversation was interrupted by Sergeant Major Rodriguez, who entered with his characteristic no-nonsense demeanor. Senior Chief Martinez, he said with obvious respect, General Morrison wants to see you in the command center. The operational assessment you prepared has some people very interested. As Sarah gathered her materials, Rodriguez added quietly, Ma'am, I want you to know that some of us suspected there was more to your background than you were letting on. Your work was too good, too sophisticated. But even we didn't guess Navy SEAL. What gave it away? Sergeant Major. The way you organized information. The factors you considered. The assumptions you made automatically. It all pointed to someone with serious military experience. Plus, he smiled slightly, you have the bearing of someone who's been in tough situations and come through them. Walking to the command center, Sarah reflected on how quickly the base's entire social dynamic had shifted. Personnel who had previously ignored her now stopped to greet her respectfully. Officers sought her opinion on matters they would not have discussed with her days earlier. The command center was buzzing with activity when she arrived. General Morrison was studying her operational assessment alongside several other senior officers she had not previously met. Senior Chief Martinez. Morrison called out when he saw her. Excellent timing. I want you to meet some people. He gestured toward a group of officers gathered around a large display screen. Colonel Patricia Hayes, Marine Corps Special Operations Command. Colonel David Chun, Army Special Forces. And Colonel Michael Torres, Air Force Special Operations. Sarah immediately understood the significance of this gathering. These were commanders from all the special operations branches, which suggested that her assessment had implications beyond the single operation she had been planning. Gentlemen, lady, Morrison continued. Meet Senior Chief Sarah Martinez, Navy SEALs retired. She's the one who prepared the operational assessment you've been reviewing. Colonel Hayes stepped forward first. Senior Chief, your integration of tactical and logistical planning is remarkable. We're looking at applications for joint special operations that could revolutionize how we approach mission planning. The contingency frameworks you developed could be adapted for multiple operation types, Colonel Chen added. Your approach to risk assessment and mitigation is particularly sophisticated. Colonel Torres was studying one of her charts. The way you've accounted for inter-service coordination challenges shows understanding that goes beyond single service operations. Have you worked joint operations before? Some, Sarah replied carefully. Morrison interjected. Senior Chief Martinez has extensive operational experience, but the details are classified. What's important is that her planning methodology could significantly improve joint operation success rates. Coronel et Noded. That's why we're here. We want to discuss expanding your role beyond this single operation to help develop new joint planning protocols. Sarah felt the weight of this proposal. They were offering her the opportunity to influence how special operations would be planned across all military branches, a significant responsibility and a return to the kind of high-level strategic work she had done during her military service. What would that involve, she asked. Initially, reviewing and optimizing planning protocols for 3 upcoming joint operations, Colonel Chun explained. If the results meet expectations, we'd want you to help develop new standard operating procedures for inter-service special operations coordination. Colonel Torres added, the work would require top-secret security clearance and coordination with special operations commands across all branches. It's essentially rebuilding how we approach complex joint missions. Morrison looked at Sarah expectantly. Senior Chief, this opportunity arose directly from the quality of your work here. Your unique perspective and experience could help save lives and improve mission success rates across the special operations community. The offer was both flattering and daunting. It would mean returning fully to the military world she had left behind, taking on responsibilities at the highest levels of special operations planning, and working with classified information and strategic objectives. General, I'm honored by the confidence you're showing, Sarah began. But I need to understand the full scope of what you're proposing. Colonel Hayes opened a briefing folder. The 3 operations we want you to review involve coordination between Navy SEALs, Marine Raiders, Army Rangers, and Air Force Pararescue. Current planning approaches treat each service component as separate entities rather than integrated elements of a unified mission. The inefficiencies are significant, Colonel Chen continued. Equipment redundancy, communication gaps, conflicting tactical priorities. Your planning approach addresses these problems systematically. Colonel Torres pointed to one of Sarah's organizational charts. This framework for integrated logistics and tactical planning could reduce operation complexity by 30% while improving success probability significantly. Morrison watched Sarah's reaction carefully. Senior Chief, I know this is a big decision. You left active duty for reasons that are your own, and returning to this level of involvement might not align with your current goals. Sarah considered the implications. This opportunity would mean returning to the high-stakes world of special operations planning, working with classified information, and bearing responsibility for mission outcomes that could affect national security. But it would also mean using her skills and experience at their highest level to potentially save lives and improve military effectiveness. What's the timeline for a decision? She asked. We'd like an answer within 48 hours, Colonel Hayes replied. The first operation is scheduled for planning phase initiation next week. Morrison added, Senior Chief, I want you to know that regardless of your decision on this expanded role, your work here has been exceptional. You've already improved this operation significantly, and you've demonstrated capabilities that have impressed some of the most experienced special operations leaders in the military. As the meeting concluded, Sarah found herself facing a crossroads. The opportunity being offered represented a chance to return to the kind of work she had excelled at during her military service, but at a level of responsibility and visibility that would fundamentally change her civilian life. Walking back to her office, she encountered Captain Stevens again. This time, his demeanor was completely different from their first interactions. Senior Chief, he said, I heard about the joint operations opportunity. That's incredible recognition of your capabilities. It's certainly unexpected, Sarah replied. Can I ask you something? Stevens paused. When you first arrived here and we were treating you like an amateur, did you ever want to just tell us who you really were and put us in our place? Sarah smiled. The thought occurred to me, but proving competence through work is more satisfying than demanding respect through credentials. Stevens nodded thoughtfully. That's a lesson I won't forget. The best people often don't need to announce their qualifications. Their work speaks for itself. That evening, as Sarah reviewed the joint operations proposal in her apartment, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had come to the base as a civilian contractor, hoping to quietly apply her skills in a new context. Instead, she found herself being offered the opportunity to shape the future of special operations planning. Her Navy SEAL ring caught the light as she turned the pages of the classified briefing materials. The ring that had remained largely unnoticed during her first days at the base had become a symbol of the expertise and experience that had finally been recognized and valued. The decision ahead was significant. Accepting the joint operations role would mean fully returning to the military world she had left behind. Declining would mean walking away from an opportunity to use her skills at their highest level for the benefit of the special operations community. As she prepared for bed, Sarah knew that whatever decision she made would fundamentally shape the next chapter of her life. The quiet civilian contractor who had been ridiculed for her humble appearance had proven that true expertise often comes in unexpected packages. Now she had to decide how she wanted to use that expertise going forward. Tomorrow would bring new conversations, new decisions, and new opportunities to prove that competence and dedication matter more than assumptions and first impressions. The ring on her finger was no longer a secret symbol of past achievements. It had become a visible reminder of the responsibility that comes with proven capability. The woman they had ridiculed for her task had not only proven herself worthy of respect, she had demonstrated expertise that could reshape how the military's most elite units planned and executed their most critical missions. The only question remaining was whether she was ready to accept that level of responsibility once again.